Erev Tov Rabotai, we're continuing with our Mishna Yomi Masechet Demai. We're up to Perek Zayin Mishnah Bet. Now, the Mishnah yesterday taught us that a person is allowed to eat an Amaras' food on Shabbat by making a declaration before Shabbat designating the Demai tithes. This Mishnah today is going to add another law. The declaration that you made before Shabbat has to be repeated on Shabbat just before he eats the food. Now, the declaration this Mishnah is going to use is the same declaration as the previous Mishnah. However, the wording is slightly different because our Mishnah is going to speak of drink rather than solid food. In the case of solid food, you would repeat exactly the words of the previous Mishnah. Our Mishnah today is going to speak about wine to teach that the declaration for drinks is different than the declaration for solid foods. Now, the Tosfot Yom Tov says in the name of the Yerushalmi, you're not going to say this out loud, but you're going to whisper it so as not to insult your host. The Mishnah says, Mazgulo etakos, when they pour for the guest a cup of wine on Shabbat, Omer, he says again the declaration that he said before Shabbat, Ma she'ani atid l'she'er b'shulei hakos, that which I leave at the bottom of the cup, the 100th of the wine, Hareu Maaser, is hereby designated as part of the Maaser Rishon for the wine I'm going to drink. Ushar Maaser Samuchlo, and the rest of the Maaser Rishon, the other 9/10, is designated next to it at the bottom of the cup. Now the Mefarshim point out several things here. First of all, yesterday's Mishnah, when we said the declaration we said yesterday was Ma shani atil la'afrish machar, that which I'm going to separate tomorrow. The reason here we don't say that, we say that which I will leave at the bottom of the cup, is because in the case of food, it's possible to separate a small portion of the food on Shabbat before eating it without the host noticing. But in the case of the liquids, it's usually impossible for a guest to pour out some of the drink without the host noticing. Therefore, you give a different declaration. It's very normal for a guest to leave a small amount of his drink at the bottom of the cup. The host won't realize that the guest suspects him of not tithing properly. So what does he do? He says that the wine that he leaves at the bottom of the cup, he wants it to be the first 100th of the Maaser Rishon. Then the rest of the Maaser Rishon, the other 9/10, should be next to it. The Mishnah says, Zeh she'asiti, Mishnah continues, Zeh she'asiti Maaser asui terumat Maaser alav. Then he says, that 100th, which I first made Maaser Rishon, is now made into terumat Maaser for the Maaser Rishon. Maaser sheni bepiv, in the Maaser Sheni for the wine is designated at the top of the cup, and it's hereby redeemed unto coins that I set aside for this purpose. Now, since he made the declaration before and on Shabbat, he can drink what he served as long as he remembers to leave the 1/100th of the wine in the bottom of the cup as Terumat Maaser. And the Mefarshim explain that the wine that he leaves at the bottom of the cup becomes Terumat Maaser retroactively to the time before he drank the wine, so now it's permissible to him to drink it. Now, although it's using the concept of birera, the portion on the bottom that I'm leaving over really was the terumat maaser to begin with. We already learned that you can rely on birera in cases of demai. Now, when you repeat this declaration on Shabbat, that's not considered the same as tithing at Shabbat, which you cannot do, because the main act of tithing, the main declaration, was done before Shabbat came in. Nevertheless, since the demai wasn't available before Shabbat, it's proper that you should identify the tithes on Shabbat again before you eat the food. That is how the Tiferet Yisrael explains the Mishnah. That is the end, Rabotai, of Mishnah Bet. Mishnah Gimel now is going to discuss a similar case where the rabbis permitted you to tithe the demai food before you actually have it. Po'el sheno ma'amin ba'al, a worker who was given the right to eat from the dried figs he is working on, but he doesn't trust the employer to separate, that he separated the maaser from them. He does the following before he eats it. Now, Rabotai, just to point out, the Mefarshim explained to us that the Mishnah is talking about a case where either the employer agreed to provide his worker with food as part of the wages, or it's in a place where this is the common practice that the worker can eat on the food that he works. He can eat the food that he works on. Now, the worker is entitled to eat from the figs that he's working on. However, he doesn't trust the employer that he tied the figs. So what does the worker want to do? He wants to tie the figs in advance so that he's able to keep eating each fig without having to separate physically each time he wants to have a fig. So the Mishnah says, Noten grogeret achat ve'omer. He takes one dried fig and he says, Zu v'tesha ba'ot achareh. This dried fig and the 9 that come after it, the next 9 that I'm going to take, asuyot ma'aser al tishim shani ochel. This fig I'm holding and the following 9 are made into ma'aser rishon for the other 90 figs that I will eventually eat. Meaning, the Mefarshim explain, the way the Chazon Ish explains it, for the other 90 figs that I will now be able to take and eat because they are now chulin, I want these 9 figs to cover for it. Well, really, the one I'm holding and then the 9 that come after are these 10 figs. Now, the Mishnah is speaking about a situation where the worker is allowed to eat 100 figs. It makes it easier to calculate. So you need 10 figs for the Maaser Rishon, of which one will be separated as Terumat Maaser and given to the Kohen. So the Mishnah says again, you take one dried fig and you say, this dried fig and the 9 that come after it, the one I'm going to take afterwards, asuyot maaser al tishim shani ochel, they're made into maaser rishon for the other 90 figs that I will eventually eat. Zu asuyat tumat maaser alehen, and this dried fig that I'm holding now is made into tumat maaser for the other 9 figs of the maaser rishon. Maaser sheni ba'acharona, and the maaser sheni for these dried figs is designated in the later figs, which is in the next 9 figs, because now you have figs number 11 through 19 are going to be designated as maaser sheni. And it's redeemed onto the coins that I've set aside for this purpose. He then is allowed to begin eating the figs, but he has to refrain from eating the one dried fig that he designated as Terumat Maaser, which must be given to a Kohen, and he can only eat 99 out of the 100. And the Mefarshim explain that he's even allowed to eat the figs that he designated as Maaser Rishon and Maaser Sheni, because Maaser Rishon of Demai doesn't have to be given away, and the Maaser Sheni he redeemed unto the coins. Now, he's not allowed to take an additional fig from the owner to replace the one he separated as Terumat Maaser. Why? Because the employer agreed to give him 100 figs, not 101. The Rav says if you would take another fig, you would be stealing. Now, the Tiferet Yitzchak points out, even though the employer agreed to give the worker 100 figs that he can eat, meaning tithe figs, he does claim, the owner claims that it's tithe. Just because the worker doesn't believe him, that's not enough of a reason to obligate the owner to give him another fig. The Mishnah continues, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel Omer, Rabban Shimon Gamliel says, Lo yachsoch, the worker should not refrain from eating the full 100 figs, because if he eats less than the amount he's used to eating, 100 figs, he's going to reduce the quality of his work for his employer because he won't have as much strength as he needs. So what does the Rav say? The Rav says he has to buy an additional fig from the employer as a replacement for the one that he designated as Terumat Maaser, so that now he can eat his regular 100 figs. Now, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel agrees with the first Tana that the employer is not obligated to give the worker the additional fig to replace the one that he separated as Terumat Maaser. However, he argues that the worker is not allowed to eat less than his usual amount. Why? Because that will negatively affect his quality of work. A worker has to be careful. We know that the Tosefta but Metzia teaches us a worker has to be very careful to eat and rest properly to make sure that he is able to do his work to the best of his ability. And if he wouldn't do so, it would be stealing from his employer. So Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says he has to buy another fig from his employer to equal 100 figs that he's eating what he's normally used to, and he'll be able to work properly. Now, although the first Tana Kama and Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel disagree about how many figs the worker has to eat, they both agree that the piece you separate as Terumat Maaser is subtracted from the worker's share of figs. The Mishnah is going to bring us now a Tana who disagrees. Rabbi Yossi says, Lo yachsoch, the worker doesn't have to refrain from eating 100 of his employer's figs. Why? Because it is a condition of the Beddin, a decree of the Chachamim. Tanai Beddin means the Beddin, the Chachamim made a stipulation that an employer has to compensate the worker for the Terumat Maaser that he separates from his share. And the Mefarshim point out that according to Rabbi Yossi, it is the employer who has to suffer the loss of the Terumat Maaser. Therefore, the worker is allowed to take an additional fig from his employer to replace the one that he separates Terumat Maaser. And the Mefarshim point out that the Tanai Beddin, the condition of the court, is that the worker can take another fig from his employer without having to ask his permission. So it comes, according to Rabbi Yossi, really the employer ends up giving the worker 101 figs, 100 for the worker's meal, and the one for the Terumat Maaser. However, the Rab does tell us that the court is not obligated, the Tanai Beddin, the court did not obligate the employer to give any extra figs for Maaser Sheni. Why? Because since the worker can eat those figs right away by redeeming them, the Chachamim did not impose the cost of the Maaser Sheni on the owner when this employer is going to now put it onto the coins and take them to Yerushalayim and eat it there. That is the end of today's Mishnah. Mi Rabotai, Baruch Adonai Le'olam, Amen v'Amen.